In the summer of 1943, on the fields around a small Russian town called Kursk, Germany and the Soviet Union fought the biggest single battle in the history of warfare, with over 3 million men, nearly 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 7,000 aircraft, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces engaged in a 50-day struggle that would determine the fate of Nazi Germany and change the course of the Second World War forever. The German army believed they could strike the Red Army so hard that the Soviets would no longer be able to launch major offensives. But when the battle ended in late August 1943, Germany had suffered a catastrophic defeat that would accelerate the Reich's collapse and make Soviet victory inevitable. The irony of Kursk was that the Red Army suffered 6 times higher casualties in terms of men and equipment destroyed. And yet, despite these enormous losses, the Soviets won because Germany could no longer afford to lose men and tanks at such rates, and because Germany's strategic situation was so precarious that any failure meant eventual defeat and the end of the German dream of European dominance. In spring 1943, Nazi Germany's leaders faced a strategic dilemma because the Soviets had stopped at Stalingrad. Allied bombers were pounding German cities, and Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. Adolf Hitler and his generals knew they could not defeat the Soviet Union while fighting a two-front war, so Hitler decided Germany would take the offensive on the Eastern Front to cripple Soviet capability before the Allies opened a second front in France. But Hitler was cautious about what Germany could accomplish, telling his generals that Germany could not undertake any large operation in the East and must pursue only limited strikes because he believed that once the Anglo-Americans tried and failed in France, Germany could strike a decisive blow against the Soviet Union. The immediate priority for Hitler in spring 1943 was to draw the Red Army into a battle of attrition that would weaken the Soviets so badly that they would not be able to launch their own major offensive in the year ahead, because in spring 1943, the Red Army outnumbered the Wehrmacht in the east by 2.1 to 1 in men, by 4.6 to 1 in tanks, and by 3.1 to 1 in artillery guns and mortars, and Germany could not afford to allow the Soviets to dictate the terms of battle. The Red Army was indeed planning sweeping offensives in 1943, planning to smash the Germans around Oriol, which would open the way to Bryansk and Minsk and Poland and East Prussia, while a simultaneous offensive through Kharkiv would allow them to recapture Poltava and Kiev and threaten the German rear and Germany's Hungarian and Romanian allies. And if the Soviet plan succeeded, the war might be over by 1944 and Germany would be defeated. So Germany had a conservative plan for the Eastern Front in summer 1943, while the Soviets had high hopes for major breakthroughs that would win the war. And both sides were focusing their attention on the area around the town of Kursk, where a massive salient in the front lines offered the Germans an opportunity to encircle and destroy the Red Army. The Soviet General Staff expected the Germans to attack at Kursk and deployed 2 army groups to defend it under Rokossovsky and Vatutin, with a reserve army under Konev for counterattacks and to exploit any Soviet breakthrough. Red Army engineers turned the salient into a fortress, building 6 defensive belts with nearly 10,000 kilometers of trenches dug 4 lines deep, deploying over 1 million mines designed to destroy German tanks and employing 300,000 civilian workers, mostly women, to prepare the defenses. The Soviets created anti-tank strongpoints throughout the salient, with each containing anti-tank riflemen, engineers with explosives, 4 to 10 anti-tank guns, and 2 or 3 tanks or self-propelled guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The backbone of the defense was artillery, with up to 70 guns per kilometer of front in some sectors, giving the Soviets overwhelming firepower to stop German armor. And Soviet partisans launched over 1,000 attacks in June alone against German logistics and infrastructure. But even as the Soviets prepared to defend the Kursk salient, some Soviet leaders began to doubt whether a purely defensive strategy was the right choice, and Joseph Stalin and Nikolai Vatutin both argued that the Red Army should attack the Germans first to spoil the expected German offensive before it could begin. But the Soviet marshals Vasilevsky and Zhukov convinced Stalin to begin with defense to weaken German armored formations before going over to the counterattack. The Soviets were particularly concerned about the new German heavy Tiger tanks, which they had captured and studied carefully, and the test results showed that the Tiger's armor was extremely strong and that regular Soviet weapons had difficulty penetrating it. And Soviet soldiers were deeply worried about the Tigers, with one soldier writing that the worst part was that Soviet guns and tanks were not equal to the Tiger. The Soviets learned quickly how to fight the Tigers, training anti-tank crews to target the vision ports and commanders' hatches, which had a tendency to shear off after being hit, and they prepared detailed tactics and regulations for engaging the German heavy tanks. Meanwhile, Hitler and his generals debated where and when to attack the Soviet Union. And while Hitler originally wanted to attack in the Donbass region to secure control of its critical natural resources, it was his generals who convinced the Führer to attack at Kursk to cripple Soviet offensive potential and prevent the Red Army from launching devastating counter-offensives. But the attack was delayed again and again through the spring and early summer, because in April, General Walter Model told Hitler that he thought he could win at Kursk, but his Ninth Army was not yet strong enough. So Hitler decided to wait for reinforcements to arrive from Germany and occupied territories. Then, in May, when Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, Hitler feared that Italy might soon leave the alliance, or the Allies might land in Sicily or Greece. So Hitler decided to wait until the situation in the Mediterranean became clear before committing Germany's armored reserves to the Eastern Front. Then, in the second half of May, heavy rains turned the roads in the Soviet Union into mud and made any attack impossible, preventing German armor from maneuvering effectively. And in June, when everything was finally ready, Hitler was still hesitant because Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Kurt Seitzler kept telling him that the Red Army was getting stronger every day, and that the longer Germany waited, the worse their chances would be. So Hitler decided he would wait for the Soviets to attack first instead, thinking that a defensive victory would be easier to achieve. But then, in late June, the commander of Army Group Center, Günther von Kluge, convinced Hitler that he must attack as soon as possible. And so Operation Citadel was finally set to begin on July 5, 1943. The German plan was to encircle the Red Army and crush them in a giant pocket, with General Walter Model's Ninth Army attacking from the north, tasked with breaking through the strongest Soviet positions in just 2 days and completing the northern half of the encirclement, while the southern pincer, consisting of General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, would attack from the south and meet up with the Ninth Army to trap the Red Army's best forces in a massive pocket and destroy them completely. Including their reserves, the Germans had about 900,000 men, 3,900 tanks and self-propelled guns, 1,800 planes, and 8,300 artillery pieces and mortars to throw into the battle, representing the maximum effort Germany could commit without leaving the rest of the Eastern Front dangerously weak. But the German plan had a fatal flaw because they badly underestimated Soviet strength and the scale of Soviet preparations, and the Red Army had 2.6 million men, 8,900 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,900 planes, and 47,400 artillery pieces and mortars available for the battle, giving the Soviets an overwhelming numerical advantage of nearly 3-to-1 in men and 2-to-1 in tanks and aircraft that the Germans had not adequately accounted for in their planning. The German intelligence services failed to provide accurate information about Soviet strength, and German commanders believed the Soviet defenses would crumble in the face of German armor and tactical skill, a miscalculation that would prove fatal to the entire operation. So the Germans had finally decided to attack at Kursk, just what the Soviets had been preparing for months to defend against. But when the battle started, the Red Army received advance warning because in the night of July 4th to 5th, several German soldiers crossed the lines to surrender and told the Soviets the attack was imminent and would begin at dawn. Soviet aircraft and artillery sprang into action to catch the Germans in their jumping-off positions before they could launch their assault, and Soviet commanders launched preemptive strikes against German assembly areas. Soviet commanders claimed that their artillery fire blasted the enemy troops preparing to attack and disrupted German command systems, but in reality, Soviet artillery strikes came too soon and did little damage, and German fighters shot down 300 Soviet planes on the first day alone. So the narrative of a successful Soviet preemptive strike was a myth created after the war. When the ground attack began on July 5th, the Germans broke through the first defensive belt in both the north and south, shocking Soviet commanders who expected that months of preparation would provide better results. And the next day, the Germans pierced the second belt despite the enormous Soviet defensive preparations. In the north, Model's 9th Army struggled once it reached the 3rd Soviet defensive belt, where Soviet mines and artillery fire took a heavy toll on German vehicles and infantry, and the Germans noticed that Red Army tactics against their heavy tanks were effective, with Russian soldiers targeting the commander's hatches and vision ports of Tigers just as they had trained. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army had more success and penetrated the 3rd Soviet defensive belt on July 11th, and General Hermann Hoth wanted to continue the offensive to complete the encirclement. But by July 13th, Field Marshal von Manstein admitted that his forces were too weak to surround the Soviets on their own, although he wanted the offensive to continue. But Hitler told Manstein that the 4th Panzer Army would have to give up some of its forces to help counter the Allied landings in Sicily, which was just an excuse because Hitler did not send any units from the Eastern Front to Sicily for the next 10 days. But Manstein reluctantly accepted that Operation Citadel had failed and would have to be called off. But even as the German offensive was grinding to a halt in the face of overwhelming Soviet resistance, the Soviet counteroffensive began on July 12th, when the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the German positions defending Oriol, breaking through the German lines and forcing the 9th Army to send reinforcements to plug the gaps, which sealed the fate of the German offensive beyond any doubt. At the same time, further south, the Red Army attacked the 4th Panzer Army's vulnerable spearhead, and the 5th Guards Tank Army launched an assault near the village of Prokhorovka on July 12th, tasked with destroying German armor and breaking through the German line. The Soviets used radio transmissions and fake troop movements to convince the Germans there were additional Soviet armies west of the German spearheads. But when the 5th Guards Tank Army smashed into the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, confusion reigned because German intelligence failed to anticipate the Soviet attack, and SS soldiers were completely surprised by the sudden appearance of Soviet tanks and infantry. But despite the shock, the Germans recovered quickly and inflicted a devastating defeat on the attacking 5th Guards Tank Army, knocking out 382 Soviet tanks and assault guns with 227 destroyed, while the Soviets could only knock out a dozen German tanks, a massive disparity that stood in stark contrast to later Soviet claims that Prokhorovka was a major Soviet success. For the Germans, Prokhorovka was only a limited local tactical defensive success in the face of the larger strategic collapse of Operation Citadel, because the Soviets still had the upper hand despite their heavy losses, and they prepared to launch their main counteroffensive after regrouping. On August 3rd, the Red Army launched the final phase of the battle with Operation Rumiantsev, when 7 Soviet armies, including 2 tank armies, stormed the weakened German lines in the southern part of the Kursk salient, with 3 more Soviet armies joining over the next few days for a total of 1 million men and 2,440 tanks attacking against the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, which had only 210,000 men and 640 tanks, of which just 270 were combat-ready. The Red Army immediately smashed the German line north of Kharkiv and advanced toward the southwest, forcing German units to retreat hastily to avoid encirclement. And on August 5th, Soviet forces liberated Belgorod and Oryol, the first time since 1941 that the Red Army had beaten the Wehrmacht in a summer battle. In Moscow, Red Army cannons fired a massive 124-gun salute at midnight to commemorate the double liberation, and Soviet forces continued their relentless advance. On August 7th, elements of the 1st Tank Army reached Bogodukov, just 50 kilometers from Kharkiv, and nearly behind German forces fighting there, forcing the Germans to rush panzer divisions from other parts of the front to stop the dangerous Soviet drive. The fighting developed into another major tank battle, as both sides committed more reinforcements, and the Germans even weakened their forces defending Kharkiv, which Hitler wanted to hold at all costs to stop the Soviet advance toward Poltava, the most important logistics hub for Army Group South. On August 11th, the Red Army launched another attack with the fresh 1st Guards Army, tasking it with encircling Kharkiv from the south, and by this time, Army Detachment Kempf was surrounded on 3 sides, and the defense of Kharkiv was becoming untenable. By August 18th, Hitler admitted the situation in Kharkiv was hopeless for the Wehrmacht, risking another Stalingrad-style disaster, so he allowed Manstein to give up the city. The same day, the Germans completed their retreat from Oryol, and on August 22nd to 23rd, the Wehrmacht abandoned Kharkiv, ending the 50-day battle. The Battle of Kursk was the biggest battle of the Second World War and one of the bloodiest in the history of warfare, and historians still debate the exact casualties, but it is believed that at least 1.2 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded, with 7,000 tanks and assault guns destroyed and 3,000 aircraft lost. The Germans lost about 203,000 dead, wounded, and missing, 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 650 aircraft, which meant that although Soviet losses were far heavier, the Battle of Kursk was a catastrophic defeat for Germany because Germany could not afford to lose men and equipment at such rates. Germany lost because they did not achieve any of their objectives. They did not destroy the Soviet forces at Kursk, they did not weaken the Red Army enough to prevent its massive offensive, they did not shorten the front to free up reserves for other theaters, and they did not capture hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners they wanted as forced laborers. Germany lost because their strategic situation was so precarious and desperate that any failure meant inevitable eventual defeat, and the losses at Kursk could not be replaced anywhere in the German war economy or industrial base. Germany lost because even while German soldiers fought with tremendous skill and courage and discipline against overwhelming odds and massive numerical disadvantages, Germany's industrial capacity and manpower could not sustain such a war of attrition on 2 fronts simultaneously against the combined resources of the entire world. Hitler had hoped that a victory at Kursk would convince the world that the Wehrmacht was still invincible, and that Germany would ultimately prevail in the war, But the result was the opposite of what he had hoped. For the first time, the Red Army had stopped a German summer offensive within days, and despite suffering enormous Soviet losses 6 times heavier than German casualties, the Soviets went on the offensive all along the entire Eastern Front. German morale in both the army and the civilian population began to collapse, because in spring 1943, most Germans still believed military victory over the Soviet Union was possible. But after Kursk, that fundamental belief in German victory died and was replaced by growing realization that Germany might lose the war. By the end of summer 1943, German combat power in the East was exhausted and broken. And from this point forward, Germany would be slowly and inexorably pushed back toward its own borders as the Red Army grew stronger and the German army grew weaker, and the Soviet Union advanced over 1,000 miles westward across Eastern Europe.
This sense somehow that victory was a long way off, but it was vaguely, possibly imperceptibly discernible.
In spring 1945, the Red Army stood at the gates of Berlin, ready to deliver the final blow against Nazi Germany. And the road from Kursk to Berlin would be paved with the blood and suffering and destruction of millions of people caught in the middle, between two titanic forces, locked in a desperate struggle to the death for the fate of Europe and the world. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world. Thank you for watching and supporting our history channel.